All right, the next React design pattern that we're going to take a look at is something called higher order components. Now, higher order components are basically components that instead of just returning JSX, they return another component. That might sound like somewhat of a confusing topic at first, so let's take a look at the basics behind how it works. So as everyone should know, most components in React simply return some sort of JSX, which represents the DOM elements that that component wants to be rendered in its place. However, with higher order components, as I said, they return a component which then returns JSX. So basically what we're doing here is adding an extra step inside of it. Now, if that still sounds confusing, just remember one thing for now before we take a look at our examples, and that is that higher order components are just functions that return components. So if you want to think about them as sort of component factories, right? Functions that you can call to create new components. If that works for you, then go ahead and think about it that way for now. So the next question is, why would we want to actually create these higher order components? Well, one thing that higher order components are used for is sharing behavior between several of our components, right? And this is actually a lot like what we saw with our container components, how we were able to wrap different types of components in the same container and have them behave somewhat similarly. So higher order components allow us to do something similar to that, as you'll see. Another thing that they're used for is to add extra functionality to an existing component of ours. So if we have an existing component that someone else built, what we can do is use higher order components to add new functionality to that component. All right, so for our first example of higher order components, what we're going to do is create a component that will allow us to automatically print out the props from different components. So first of all, you're going to want to copy the starting state from the exercise files, since it's different than what we saw before. Namely, we have our server.js file, which is back again from when we last used it. And we also have a few of the old components that we've built previously, such as user info. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start off by creating a new file, and we'll call this file printprops.js. So this printprops thing is going to be a higher order component. Let me show you what it looks like exactly. We're going to start off by saying export const printprops equals, and this is going to be a function that takes a component as an argument. Okay, so it's going to look like that. Now, one thing that I want to point out before we move on is that higher order components don't normally follow the same convention as regular React components, having a capital letter at the beginning of their variable name. And the reason for that is that with higher order components, we almost never actually display them inside JSX directly, right? So we'll never display this print props component inside JSX like that, which is why we don't need to start it with a capital letter. So now that we have that component defined, what we're going to do is return a new component. Okay, so we're going to say return, and this component is going to look just like a regular component would look. In other words, it's just going to be a function. Okay, and it's going to take the component's props like that and return some JSX in its place. Namely, we're just going to display the component that we passed in as an argument with all of the props passed through from the component we're returning. Okay, so essentially this unnamed component here that we're returning from printprops is simply going to display the component that we passed in when we first called our higher order component here. Now, in order to make this printprops higher order component live up to its name, what we're going to do is print out the props inside this component that we're returning. So we're going to say console.log props, and that's all there is to it. So now that we have this higher order component, how do we actually use it? Well, in order to see that, let's open up app.js, and we're going to say import printprops from printprops. And we're also going to import this user info component, which we've seen earlier in the course. So we're going to say import user info from user info. Okay, now the way that we're going to use this printprops higher order function is we're basically going to create a wrapper around our user info component, and that wrapper will automatically print the props that are getting passed into it. Here's what I mean by that. We're going to say something like const user info wrapped, we'll call it, equals print props, and we're going to call our print props higher order component, passing the user info component as an argument. Okay, so this user info wrapped thing now is this component that we're returning from our print props function. It's almost as if we were to say export const user info wrapped equals this thing right here. That's essentially what we're saying in our app file here when we're saying user info wrapped equals print props user info. Okay? All right, so the way that we're going to display this user info wrapped component now is simply using JSX syntax like this. We're going to say user info wrapped, and let's just pass a few different props to it. It doesn't have to be any of the props that user info is expecting per se, right? We don't have to pass in user. We can just pass in a prop called A, which will be number 1. We'll pass in another prop called B, which will be a string that says hello. We'll pass in another one C, which is going to be an object, I guess, with, we'll say name Sean, that kind of thing. And what we're going to see now, if we run our code, and you don't need to run the server file for this yet, we'll get to that later. We're going to say npm run start, and that's going to display our user info component, right? And it's displaying loading just because of what we did earlier, where we displayed loading if user didn't exist, okay? So ignore that part. What we're interested in here is the higher order component that we created, which is automatically displaying the props that we're passing into it. So we can see that we have A1, B hello, C, which is an object with name equal to Sean. So this print props thing has been a very simple example of a higher order component. And the cool part is that it can obviously be used for things that are a lot more useful than printing props. All right, so now that we've seen the basics of how to create higher order components, the next thing we're going to take a look at is how to use higher order components to load data and give that to components. This is going to be pretty similar to what we saw before with container components. So what we're going to be doing is creating a higher order component called withUser that will basically take care of loading user data from the server and passing it to the component that we wrap it with. So let's start off by creating a new file here called withuser.js. And here's what this component is going to look like. We're going to say import React use state and use effect from React. And we're also going to import the Axios package that we saw before. Say import Axios from Axios. We're going to be using that to load data. And then we're going to say export const with user. And just like we saw with our print props higher order component, this with user higher order component is going to take a component as an argument. Okay, and it's also going to take another argument, which will be the ID of the user that we want this higher order component to load. All right, and then what this higher order component is going to do is return a component that simply takes the props object. You'll see how we use that in just a second here. And inside here, we're going to have a state variable, which is going to be the user that we want to load from the server. So we're going to say user, set user equals use state. The initial value of the user is going to be null. We're going to load the user with a use effect hook, where we'll say async, and we're going to get the response by saying const response equals await axios.get. Inside backticks here, we're going to put the URL of the user's endpoint. So we're going to say /users/ and then the user's ID. Okay, and under that, we're going to say set user to response.data. And then we're going to call this async function by putting parentheses after it. Okay, so that is our use effect hook. The only thing we have to do now is return the original component that we passed in as an argument to our withUser higher order component with this user state as an additional prop. Now, the way we're going to do that, we don't actually have to clone the element as we saw before because we're passing in a component and not a React element. So what we're going to do is say return component. We're going to pass in the original props. So the component we create by calling with user is going to behave exactly like the original component, except with extra user loading capabilities. And to add the user prop to this component, we're going to say user equals user. Okay, so we're taking all of the original props and adding our own user prop. And that's pretty much all we need to do. So now that we've created our with user higher order component, let's go into our app component and see how it works. We're going to start off, obviously, by importing the with user higher order component we just created. And then, just like we did with print props, which I'm going to just remove here, we're going to say const user info, and we can call it user info wrapped, user info enhanced. I'm going to call it user info with loader. And then we'll say equals with user and wrap our original user info component. Okay, and then we just have to display our user info with loader component that we just created by saying user info with loader. We don't have to pass any props, but what we do have to do, I almost forgot this, is pass in the ID of the user we want to load as the second argument here. So let's just load user number 234, right? The user with ID 234. What we're going to do, we're going to need to actually run the server before this will work. So I'm going to open up another terminal, and we can run the server, remember, by saying node server.js. And there we go. So let's head over to our app, and we'll reload it. We have the user with ID 234 loaded from our server through the use of a higher order component called with user. Okay, so now that we've seen how to load data with a higher order component, the next thing we're going to take a look at is how to take this one step further and allow our higher order components to also edit server data. What we're going to do is, let's say that instead of just having a user info component that displays the info of a user, let's say that we have another component, which we'll create right here, called user info form, which allows us to edit the information of a user on the server. Now, if you look back in the server.js file, you'll see that we have endpoints that will allow us to edit the user as well, right? These are post endpoints, as you'll see. So we're going to come back and implement our user info form shortly, but before we do that, let's create a new file which will be our higher order component, and we're going to call this higher order component with editable user. And the basic idea of this higher order component is that in addition to loading the user from the server and passing it to the component that we wrap with it, it's going to allow the component that we wrap to change that resource through several other props that it'll pass to it. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So to start off, we're going to import React, use state and use effect from React. And we're also going to import Axios from Axios, which we'll be using to make network requests. And then we're going to export our with editable user higher order component, which is going to take a component as an argument, as well as the ID of the user that we want to load the information for and edit. And then, just like we've seen before, we're going to say return props. And this is going to be the component that we're returning here. So this component is going to have two state variables. The first state variable will be called original user and set original user. And this is going to represent the data that we have on the server side, right? So as we make changes to the data on the client side, we'll want to have a backup copy of the server side data in case we want to reset to that original data. I'll show you what that looks like shortly. So we're going to use a use state hook here now. The initial value of that state is going to be null while we're loading the user. And the next state is going to be called user and set user. And this is going to be the current data that we're editing on the client side. So we're going to say use state. The initial value for that is going to be null as well while we load the user data. All right, next up, we're going to use our use effect hook. Inside here, we're going to have an async function. And before I forget, let's add an empty array to this one. I think I might have forgotten that in our with user higher order component as well. So we'll go back in there and add that just to avoid this use effect hook firing every time the component updates. Okay. So back in our with editable user higher order component, we're going to load that data. This is going to look exactly like what we've seen before. We're going to say const response equals await axios.get. And the URL here, which we're specifying in backticks, is going to be users/user ID. All right, that's the user ID argument that we passed in up here. Okay, so now that we have our response, we're going to set both the original user and the user state variables to the response data. So we're going to say set original user response.data and set user response.data. And then we're going to call this async function like that by putting parentheses after it. And then just like we did in our with user higher order component, we're going to say return, and we're going to return the original component that we passed in as an argument with all of the props and one additional prop, which is going to be the user that we've specified here. We're going to say user equals user. Okay, so just passing that state variable through. So currently, our with editable user hook is exactly the same thing, almost, as our with user higher order component. What we're going to do, though, is add a few more functions in here that will actually modify the user data on the component when certain functions are called. Let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to start off here by specifying an onChangeUser function. And this is going to take the changes as an argument, right? It's going to be an object containing the things that we want to change about the user. And what this is going to do is say set user, and we're simply going to apply those changes to our user state up here by saying ..user .changes, right? So that's going to combine the current state of the user with the changes that are passed to this onChangeUser function, okay? And now that we've defined this function, we're going to pass it to this component as a prop. So we're going to say onChangeUser equals onChangeUser. Okay, we're going to have to specify this onChangeUser as a prop in our user info form when we implement it. All right, so that basically will make changes to the state, but we also want to have a function called onSaveUser that's basically going to write these changes to the server, right? It's going to make an actual server request that will persist these changes on the back end. So for that, we're going to say const onSaveUser equals, and this one isn't going to take any arguments, but it is going to be async, so we'll say async. And inside here, what we're going to do is make a server request by saying const response equals await axios.post. The URL we're going to be making a post request to here is the same one as we made the get request to, so /users/user ID. And we're going to want to include a request body here, which will contain the updated user that we want to write to the server. So for that, we just put an object here and add the user there. And if you take a look at the actual endpoint that this is sending a request to, you'll see that it basically just takes this user and modifies its in-memory database to make that user persistent. Okay, and now that we have our response, this response here is actually going to contain the updated user from the server. You can see that if you take a look at the endpoint again. So all we need to do is we want to set our original user to that updated user and set our user state to that response.data as well. Okay, you'll see again what this original user thing is in a second. All right, so we've specified this onSaveUser function. We're going to pass that as a prop as well to this component. So we're going to say onSaveUser equals onSaveUser. And the last function we're going to define here is going to be called onResetUser. And what that's going to do is simply reset the state of our user here to the state of our original user when we first loaded the user from the server. Okay? So that'll be used if the user is editing something in the user info form and they want to reset it to the way that it was before. Okay, so all we need to do for that, this is what the original user state is for in the first place. We're just going to say set user and set the user to the original user. Okay, and then let's pass through onResetUser as a prop to this component as well. OnResetUser equals onResetUser, and that should be all we need to do. So we have our withEditable higher order component all set up. So what we're going to need to do now is create this user info form. This should be pretty simple to implement. What we're going to do is we're actually going to import our withEditable higher order component. So import withEditable, and then we're going to say export const user info form. Now, before I go any further, what I want to say is that so far, whenever we've wanted to use a higher order component, we've specifically created a separate component without that functionality. Let's say user info, for example. And we've explicitly wrapped that with our higher order component and created another named component from that. Now, that's perfectly fine to do, and it definitely makes it nice and readable when you're using it. But what you're also allowed to do is simply use this higher order component when you define another component in the first place. What I mean by that is we're going to say export const user info form equals withEditable, okay, and then we're going to define our user info form component directly inside this withEditable component's arguments. Okay, so it's going to look like this. We're going to take the props, which will be user, on change user, on save user, on reset user. I believe that's all we need there. And then inside here, it's just going to look like a regular component. We're going to start off by getting the basic information from this user. So we'll say const name, age, and hair color equals user, or since the user can be null, we're just going to put an empty object there to avoid JavaScript errors. And then we're going to say return, and if the user has loaded, we're going to basically return a form that will allow us to edit each of these pieces of data. So we'll have name, like that, and this will be an input with the value equal to name. And on change now, instead of having a use state hook inside our user info form component that we're defining here, we're actually going to call this onChangeUser prop that the higher order component has already defined for us. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say e, and we're going to call onChangeUser with a changes object, which is just going to be an object containing the properties we want to change. And we're going to say change the name of our user in the higher order component to e.target.value. Okay? And that's basically all we need to do. So that's the name input. And this could be a label as well. It's probably better to make that a label. Label. Okay, that's just the more correct React way of doing things. And then we'll do the same thing for the user's age and hair color. Okay, so we'll have age. The type of this will be number. The value will be equal to age. And for onChange, we're going to call onChangeUser, except instead of having name here, we're going to set it to age. And we need to coerce this into a number, since by default, all values coming from inputs are going to be strings. So we'll say number and convert that into a JavaScript number there. Okay, and the last one is going to be the hair color. So let's change this to, say, hair color. Okay, the value is going to be hair color. And for onChange, the property is going to be hair color. And that is going to be set equal to e.target.value. Okay, so currently the value of each of these inputs is linked to the value of this user object through this onChangeUser prop that it's getting passed from the higher order component. So The last thing we're going to do in this user info form is add an onSaveUser and onResetUser buttons. Okay, so down here underneath all of our inputs, we're going to add a button for resetting the user. Right? This will basically reset all of the values back to what they were before we changed the input values. So we'll say button onClick equals onResetUser. And this button will say reset. And we'll have another button whose onClick method we'll call onSaveUser. And the text of that button will be save changes. Okay? And then, since we're expecting this user to be loading at some point, we're just going to add another clause to this ternary operator that just says loading inside paragraph tags. All right, and since this withEditableUser higher order component expects a second argument, which is the ID of the user, we need to add that as well down here. Right, so this big first argument is the component that we're wrapping. The second argument is the URL that we want to make these requests to. So we'll just say /users/123. And that should be all we need to do. So let's go into our app component now. We're going to import our user info form. Remember that our user info form is already wrapped in a higher order component, so we don't need to do that inside this file. User info form. Okay. And we're just going to display it right here. We'll say user info form, like that. And let's head over to our app and see if it works. Oops, it looks like I mistyped the URL here. Let's go back. Oh, and this just needs to be the user ID, not the actual URL. Okay, so we'll just pass 123 there. All right. So if we refresh our page, we're going to see that we have our form, which says John Doe, age 54, hair color brown. This data was all loaded from the server. Right? Let's say we change the hair color and click on Save Changes. That change is actually going to be persisted in the server, so if we refresh this, we'll see that it doesn't get reset. Now this reset button, the way that that works is if we change all of these to some other value, and we want to go back to what those values were that we got from the server originally, we can just click on Reset, and the higher order component will take care of resetting all of that for us. So hopefully this has all made sense, and hopefully you can also see why this withEditableUser thing is so useful, right? Basically, this allows us to create any kind of component, right? We're not just limited to our user info form here. It allows us to create any kind of component that might need to make changes to a user on the server. All right, so now that we've seen how to create a withEditableUser higher order component, we're going to take this one step further and create a withEditableResource higher order component. This will be kind of similar to what we did earlier in the course when we created a container component that did this same kind of thing. So here's what this is going to look like. We're going to start off by creating a new file for this higher order component, which we'll call withEditableResource, as I said. And we're going to start off by copying and pasting the withEditableUser higher order component. So we're just going to be making this a little bit more generic and reusable. So first of all, let's change the name of this higher order component to withEditableResource. And the next thing we're going to do is change the arguments a little bit. So it's still going to take the component as its first argument, right? The component that we're trying to wrap and then pass props to. But as its second and third props, instead of taking a user ID, since we're going to be working with resources instead of just users, right? We're going to be working with any kind of data. We're just going to specify the resource path, that is the path on the server, and we're going to specify the resource name. This is again similar to what we did earlier with container components. So the next thing we're going to do is just kind of make a few name changes. We're going to change original user to original data. And change this as well, since we're not just dealing with users anymore. And we're going to change this to data and set data. Okay, and now that we've made those changes, we're going to go through and change the logic inside the useEffect hook. So instead of having our user's endpoint hard-coded here, we're going to say axios.getResourcePath. Right, that's going to be the server endpoint there. we're going to say set original data, response.data, and set data, response.data, to reflect those name changes we made. And then what we're going to do is go through each of these three functions, on change user, on save user, on reset user, and make those more generic as well. What I'm going to do specifically is change this to on change, on save, and on reset. Okay, and then we're going to have to make these name changes in here as well. So set data, data and changes, set original data, and set data. And this URL here is going to have to change to our resource path. So resource path. And then instead of passing the prop named user, we're going to have to actually specify the resource name that we passed as an argument up here. So the way we're going to do that is in square brackets, we'll say resource name. And then after that, we'll say data. Okay. And finally, we have on reset, which we just have to change to set data and original data, like that. And now comes the kind of tricky part. What we need to do, obviously, we want to allow ourselves to pass in on change user, on save user, on reset user, right? We don't just want to shorten each of these to on change, on save, and on reset. And the reason for this is because there may be situations where we want to use the same higher order component several times over again, right? Let's say that we were building a component that needed to use both user data and product data from the server. Basically, what we would do is wrap that twice with editable resource, right? We'd say with editable resource, and then with editable resource again. And then we would wrap some component, right? We might say home page or some component like that. And the first resource would be, our products, and the outer resource here might be our users, something like that, right? So in that case, we would need the on change, on save, on reset to have names such as on change user or on change product, right? So the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to create a separate object here called resource props. And we're going to use what I would call a little bit of ninja JavaScript to make this happen. So specifically for the first prop, that prop is going to have the name equal to the resource name argument that we passed into our higher order component up above, right? So in this older case, we just said user equals user. For this one, we have to say resource name and specify that for that one, we want to pass through the data state. And then we're going to do the same things for on change, on save, on reset. The tricky part with these is that we have to actually add on change user, on save user, right, on reset user, or whatever the resource name is to the end, and we have to capitalize that. So the way that we're going to capitalize that string is by defining a capitalize function up at the very top of our component file. And this is going to be where the ninja JavaScript comes in. We're just going to say that this function takes a string, and we're going to say string.character at 0.to uppercase plus string.slice1. Okay, basically all this does is it capitalizes the first letter of a string. Don't worry too much about the JavaScript details there if you're not super strong in that. So now that we've done that, what we're going to do is specify the other prop names inside this resource props here. What we're going to do, we're going to use square brackets and say on change, and then into this template string, we're going to insert the capitalized resource name. So capitalize resource name, and that's going to be our onChange function that we defined above. And then we're just going to do this exact same thing with onSave and onReset. Okay, so onSave, onReset, and we're going to change these as well. Okay, and that should really be all we need to do. The last thing we're going to do is just replace all of these user, onChange, onSave, etc. And and pass the new resource props that we've defined there to our component. So we're going to say resource props like that. And that should be all we need to do. So let's see how this thing is going to work. Oops, and I accidentally deleted a curly brace there. So the way this with editable resource component is going to work is we're going to go into our user info form component that we had from earlier. And instead of using with editable user, we're going to change this to with editable resource. So let's say import with editable resource. Change this here to with editable resource. Okay, and the props that we're destructuring inside the component are going to be exactly the same, right? Because we're going to pass in the resource name and resource path, which will be taken by our with editable resource higher order component and converted into onChange user, onSave user, onReset user, and so on. So now we just need to change the final props that we're passing to this higher order component. First, we need to pass in the path of the resource we want to load, which is going to be /users/123. And then we just have to pass in the name of the resource, which is going to be user. All right, so let's see if this thing works now. Make sure you have your front end and back end both running. And we'll head over to here and refresh. Sure enough, we see that it correctly loaded the data for us. And if we try and change this now, we'll change a few of these properties here. Give John blue hair, click on Save Changes, and if we refresh now, we'll see that those changes were persisted on the server, and we can also see that reset works. If we just make a few random changes to these things here, click Reset, that will reset all of those things to what they were before. So as you can see, everything is working just like we had it with our original with editable user, except now we can change basically any kind of resource, be it products, users, articles, anything that we need to. So that's the real power of higher order components in React.